Hey y'all! Welcome to my channel. I'm your girl Sunny coming at you with a wild historical tale that's gonna make you question everything you thought you knew about military strategy. Today we're talking about the time the great Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy who conquered half of Europe, got absolutely demolished by, wait for it, a bunch of fluffy little rabbits. Picture this. It's 1807. Napoleon Bonaparte is sitting pretty at the height of his power. The man has just signed the Treaty of Tilsit with Russia, basically carving up Europe like it's Sunday dinner at Mima's house. He's feeling himself, as they say, the Emperor of France, conqueror of nations, master of the battlefield. This man could make armies tremble with just a look. But y'all, even the mightiest oak can be felled by the tiniest woodpecker, and Napoleon was about to learn that lesson in the most humiliating way possible. Now, our boy Napoleon decided he wanted to celebrate this big diplomatic victory with a little hunting party, because nothing says I just conquered half of Europe like shooting some innocent woodland creatures, am I right? So he tells his chief of staff, Alexander Berthier, to organize a grand rabbit hunt for him and his officers. And Berthier, being the dutiful little soldier he was, said, "Yes, sir," and set about planning what he thought would be a nice, relaxing day in the French countryside. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean where Berthier made the kind of mistake that would make your mama ground you for a month. See, when you're planning a hunt for regular folk like you and me, you go out into the wild and hunt whatever God put out there. But when you're planning a hunt for the Emperor of France, you want to make sure he actually gets to shoot something, right? So Berthier decided to have hundreds of rabbits collected and released just before the hunt. Sound reasonable enough, doesn't it? Rabbits that had been living their whole lives getting fed by humans and thinking humans were their best friends in the whole wide world. Now, let me paint you a picture of this scene, because it's more beautiful than a Georgia peach sunset. There's Napoleon, standing there in all his imperial glory, probably wearing one of those fancy hats with the feathers and everything. He's got his hunting rifle. He's got his entourage of officers and dignitaries all dressed up in their finest hunting attire, looking like they stepped right out of a painting. The carriages are lined up, the servants are bustling about, and everyone's just waiting for the signal to start this grand hunt. Berthier gives the order, and hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of rabbits are released from their cages and hutches. Now, if these had been wild rabbits, they would have done what any sensible rabbit would do when faced with a bunch of humans with guns. They would have hightailed it out of there faster than you can say jackrabbit. But these weren't wild rabbits, remember? These were domestic rabbits who saw all these humans and thought, oh my goodness, it's dinner time. Y'all, what happened next was like something out of a cartoon. Instead of running away, these rabbits started running toward Napoleon and his hunting party. Picture it. Hundreds of fluffy, adorable rabbits bounding across the field like they're competing in the Olympics, and they're all heading straight for the most powerful man in Europe. At first, everybody probably thought it was kind of cute and funny. Oh, look, the little bunnies want to say hello to the emperor. But then more rabbits kept coming, and coming, and coming. It was like a fluffy, cotton-tailed tsunami, and Napoleon was standing right in its path. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who stared down the Austrian Empire, who made the Prussians shake in their boots, who could command armies with the flick of his wrist, found himself being absolutely mobbed by a bunch of hungry rabbits. These little critters were climbing up his legs, jumping on his jacket, getting tangled up in his sword belt, and basically treating the Emperor of France like he was their long-lost mama rabbit. The man who had conquered most of Europe was being conquered by bunnies. I cannot even begin to tell you how hilarious this mental image is. Here's Napoleon, trying to maintain his imperial dignity while literally being overrun by rabbits. He's probably swatting at them with his hands, maybe even using his sword to try to fend them off, while his officers are standing around not knowing whether to help or pretend like nothing's happening. According to the accounts, and yes, somebody actually wrote this down for posterity, bless them, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The emperor retreated from rabbits. He had to take refuge in his carriage while his men tried to beat back the furry invasion with sticks and clubs. Can you imagine being one of those officers? Well, sir, we've successfully defended the emperor from, the rabbit offensive. But wait, it gets better. Even when Napoleon made it to his carriage, the rabbits didn't give up. Oh no, these determined little fluff balls kept coming. They were jumping onto the carriage, trying to get inside, turning what was supposed to be a dignified imperial retreat into something that looked more like a slapstick comedy routine. The whole hunting party had to essentially flee the field, leaving behind what was probably the most confused group of rabbits in French history. These poor little critters probably spent the rest of the day wondering why their human friends had run away instead of feeding them their usual dinner. Now, you might be wondering how we even know about this story. I mean, it's not exactly the kind of thing you'd want recorded in the official imperial chronicles, right? Day 1247 of Napoleon's reign, emperor successfully defeated by small mammals. But the thing about embarrassing stories is that they have a way of getting out, especially when there are dozens of witnesses who think it's the funniest thing they've ever seen. The story comes to us primarily through the memoirs of Baron de Menival, who is Napoleon's private secretary, and it's been corroborated by other accounts from people who were there. And honey, I am so grateful that these people had the sense to write this down, because it gives us such a perfect glimpse into the humanity of someone who seemed larger than life. Think about it. Here's a man who was basically the most feared person in Europe at the time. People wrote epic poems about his victories, painted grand portraits of him crossing the Alps, and generally treated him like he was some kind of demigod. But at the end of the day, he was just a human being who could be overwhelmed by a bunch of hungry bunnies. There's something beautifully absurd about the whole situation that just tickles me pink. All of Napoleon's military genius, all his strategic brilliance, all his battlefield experience, none of it prepared him for the Great Rabbit Assault of 1807. You can plan for enemy cavalry charges, you can anticipate artillery bombardments, you can outmaneuver entire armies, but apparently nobody thinks to include rabbit swarm tactics in military training. And poor Berthier. Can you imagine having to explain this to your boss? Well, Your Imperial Majesty, the hunt didn't go quite as planned. You see, there was a slight miscommunication regarding the nature of the rabbits. That man probably never lived it down. Every time someone mentioned hunting for the rest of his career, somebody probably brought up the Great Rabbit Incident. The irony of the whole situation is just delicious. Napoleon spent his entire career trying to control everything, to plan for every contingency, to be the master of his own destiny. He reorganized entire legal systems, redrew the map of Europe, and generally bent the world to his will. But he was completely helpless against a bunch of fluffy farm animals who just wanted their dinner. It's also a perfect example of how the smallest details can completely derail the grandest plans. If Berthier had just ordered wild rabbits instead of domestic ones, this would have been a perfectly normal, forgettable hunting expedition. Instead, it became one of the most amusing footnotes in European history. It just goes to show you that sometimes the difference between triumph and disaster comes down to something as simple as knowing the difference between wild and domestic rabbits. This story also highlights something I find fascinating about historical figures. They're often so mythologized that we forget they were real people who had real, ridiculous experiences just like the rest of us. Napoleon wasn't just the great emperor or the little corporal. He was also the guy who got mobbed by rabbits that one time. And honestly, I think that makes him more interesting, not less. The rabbit incident also serves as a perfect metaphor for how unexpected challenges can come from the most unlikely sources. Napoleon could handle the combined armies of Europe, but he was completely unprepared for an enemy that operated on pure instinct and hunger. Sometimes the biggest threats aren't the ones you can see coming from miles away. Sometimes they're the ones hopping toward you looking for their next meal. What I love most about this story is how it humanizes one of history's most larger than life figures. For all his power and prestige, Napoleon was still subject to the same kind of absurd, embarrassing moments that can happen to any of us. The only difference is that most of us don't have secretaries writing down our most mortifying experiences for future generations to read about. And you know what? I bet if you could ask Napoleon about it years later, after he'd had time to process the whole experience, he probably would have laughed about it too. Because at the end of the day, there's something inherently funny about being defeated by creatures that most people consider the epitome of harmlessness and cuteness. So the next time you're having a bad day, just remember that even Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of nations, emperor of France, and one of history's greatest military minds, once had to flee from a bunch of hungry rabbits. If he could survive that level of embarrassment and still maintain his dignity, then you can probably handle whatever life throws at you too. Well, y'all, that's the story of how the mighty Napoleon met his match in the form of several hundred domestic rabbits. It just goes to show that truth really is stranger than fiction, and sometimes the most powerful people in the world can be brought low by the most unexpected opponents. Well, butter my biscuit. Wasn't that just the most ridiculous thing you ever did here? If this little tale tickled your funny bone, don't forget to smash that like button harder than Napoleon swatted at those rabbits. And honey, if you want more wild historical stories, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. I've got plenty more where that came from. Drop me a comment down below and let me know. What's the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you? Have you ever had a moment where you felt as helpless as Napoleon facing down that fluffy army? I want to hear all about it.